Ebenezer Scrooge was a successful and well-known businessman in this community. But of course he was much more than that. He was known for his kindness, his constant generous acts of service, and his laughter and joviality. He was a wonderful friend, employer, and as good a man as you could hope to meet. He always seemed so jolly. He had a splendid laugh, and even as he went about doing good, he would chuckle to himself with the sheer joy of doing it. Those who knew him would always feel that he was pleased to see them. He greeted the gentlemen with, "My dear sir," or "My fine fellow," and the ladies with, "My dear," or "My love." His nephew Fred says that when his uncle came to visit him and his wife Clara, they would have lots of fun playing games together as a family. Fred and Clara's children looked up to him as a grandfather and were always excited when he was coming to see them. Life had not always been so happy for Ebenezer. He attended boarding school in the countryside, where he was a successful student, but because of a strained relationship with his father, he would often spend school holidays at the school alone, the memory of which would move him to tears. But he did have a close relationship with his beloved sister Fan. She was quite a few years younger than Ebenezer, and she looked up to him devotedly. She was very affectionate and lived life with joy. Ebenezer loved her dearly and was greatly affected when she sadly passed away as a relatively young lady. His hard work at school led to an apprenticeship at the firm of Fezziwig, which was a happy time for Ebenezer. He would later pour out his heart in praise for old Fezziwig for making such efforts to ensure that Ebenezer and his fellow apprentice were happy and that their work was pleasurable rather than a toil. Ebenezer spoke particularly fondly of the great Christmas parties that old Fezziwig gave. This was the beginning of a successful career in business for Ebenezer, culminating in his establishing a firm with Jacob Marley. It was said that the sharpest needle was not sharper than Scrooge's mind. Not only that, but among the business community, Scrooge's name was good enough to secure any transaction he chose to put his hand to. Yet Ebenezer was later to have regrets about this stage of his life. He won't mind me mentioning it, because to speak of this time is necessary to understand the great man that he was to later become. Besides, he freely spoke of it himself, relating it as a cautionary tale to others, warning of the dangers of being consumed by the pursuit of wealth. Perhaps it was the praise of the business world after such a lonely childhood which drew him along this course. He lamented that an old acquaintance had once told him that he feared the world and its opinion of him too much. He didn't pay this much heed at the time. It's difficult to believe now, but he became secret and self-contained and as solitary as an oyster. His nephew Fred remembers how in those days Ebenezer didn't even like Christmas anymore, which seems scarcely believable now. Fred would invite his uncle Ebenezer for Christmas every year, and he said it was comical how his uncle would scowl and reply, "Humbug!" Ebenezer's sudden moment of enlightenment came many years later, one Christmas. This was when Ebenezer Scrooge became the man that we have known and loved for these many years since. He said that he was forced to look at his life and what he had become, and where his life tended in the future, and he wanted to be another man from what he had been. Even in the distress and discomfort of that moment, he accepted it with a thankful heart. Fred and Clara remember that Christmas. Now Uncle Ebenezer appeared for dinner on Christmas Day. He'd been invited, of course, but they only hoped rather than expected that he would come. You have to remember, for some time, Ebenezer had been grumpy and didn't like Christmas. As Ebenezer peeped round the door and meekly asked, "Will you let me in?" It was a wonder that Fred didn't shake his arm off. Clara hugged him until his eyes nearly popped out. Ebenezer greeted all of the other guests heartily and happily joined in all of the games and dancing. His clerk, Bob Cratchit, remembers going to work the next day. He'd been anonymously sent a huge turkey the day before and had had a very merry Christmas indeed, and he actually turned up over a quarter of an hour late and still recovering. He tried to sidle in and get straight to work, hoping he wouldn't be in too much trouble, but he was summoned to Mr. Scrooge's office, where Ebenezer maintained a poker face for a moment before suddenly leaping from his stool, giving him a dig in the ribs and announcing, "I'm going to raise your salary." At first, Bob was so startled that he thought Mr. Scrooge had gone mad and was ready to call for help. But that afternoon, they enjoyed a Christmas mulled punch together, as Mr. Scrooge outlined all of the assistance he wanted to give to Bob's family. And he did it all. He was such a generous employer and made Bob's work a happy experience, just as old Fezziwig had done for him. He became like a second father to Bob's children and paid for the medical treatment which made Tim Cratchit well and may even have saved his life. It must be emphasised that it was not enough for Ebenezer to simply stop being unkind or to abandon his previous views or to stop disparaging the spirit of Christmas. For the rest of his days, he went about actively doing good and making the world a better place. He was positively glowing with good intentions. He gave generously to good causes. He made the common welfare his business. If he saw someone in need, he liked to help as much as he could. He saw all people as being of as much worth in God's eyes as he, and he didn't want to miss an opportunity to bestow relief and happiness. Indeed, he became a good friend to many, and you always felt when you met him that just the sight of you yielded him pleasure, and that he never got over the wonder of how walking about the city meeting people would give him so much happiness. There were some men of business who laughed at him as they saw the change in him, but he let them laugh. He paid them no heed. He was wise enough to know that no good thing happens in this world without some people mocking it, and it was better that they laughed than scowled. His own heart laughed, and that was enough for him. It was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, and he kept the spirit of it all the year. May we follow his example, that the same may be truly said of us. As we mourn for our friend Ebenezer Scrooge, may we take comfort and strength from his influence in our lives. God bless us, everyone.